I want to go back to a point you mentioned earlier, which is bad as this epidemic is. These plagues that you and I are talking about now, like bubonic plague or smallpox or cholera, they just killed everybody. I mean, our plague is like a plague light, let alone the fact that we also have vaccines to help us cope with it. So we should be grateful that we don't have that this coronavirus, for its own God-given reasons, only kills about half to 1% of the people that it infects.
Yeah,
There are
whereas,
other
of course,
there are other coronaviruses that kill 10 or 30% of the people they infect. And just imagine if that had been what we were facing.
well, for some of us, of course, this is the second plague of our adult lives. And the fatality rate for HIV was basically 100%. And it lasted a long time. And it killed 600,000 people in the end in this country over a period of time. That's rivaling COVID, except it did so in a much tinier population. And so the impact was that much more intense. And it was also, unlike COVID, an absolutely almost gruesome illness once it took hold of you. The sheer torture that it imposed upon these poor men's bodies were, if you weren't there to witness it, it's very hard to explain what it was like to see someone die of AIDS. But it was an absolutely brutalizing and emotionally devastating experience. My own, and this is a paradox that Camus talks about and that other people talk about, that I felt, was that actually, as that plague receded, as the drugs came online in 1996, and we had this astonishing drop. I mean, fantastic, amazing achievement for science, the first and only retrovirus ever to have been tackled by science and stopped. But there was no rejoicing. There was acute depression among so many of us because we were both, well, it lasted over a decade and we were exhausted. But we also, survivor's guilt, which is a weird expression. I didn't even realize I was feeling it because I didn't feel guilty, but I just felt utterly flat. I felt no reason to get up. And you would think the opposite. I'd survived. I was one of those that slipped under the fence, as it were. But you're right. What also happened to us, that generation that survived, is that we did go nuts. And that's the origin of the meth epidemic that followed the AIDS epidemic, that people got into crazy-ass sex, got into escapism, got into hedonism in a way that was just completely self-destructive, and methamphetamine was a way to sort of do that. So you see this in different ways, in different plagues, with different populations, and yet the same experience is there.
Let me reflect on that for just a moment.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was a hospice doctor. I don't know if you knew this about me. I took care of people who were dying. I was a hospice doctor for many, many years. I stopped seeing patients about 12 years ago now, in around 2010 or so. And I took care of AIDS patients. About a third of my patients in the early 1990s had HIV. A third had cancer. A third had HIV. A third of the hospice patients, and a third had all other diseases combined. I remember the deaths from Kaposi sarcoma and pneumocystis pneumonia. I took care of those people, and they were, as you said, one of the things they were devastating diseases in young, principally gay men, who were in the prime of life, the very fit individuals that were young. It was just awful. I mean, awful, awful, awful. And I remember when in 1996, just as you allude to, because I was practicing hospice medicine, when HAART, highly active antiretroviral therapy, was discovered and perfected over a number of years thereafter with additional medications, the hospices emptied out. We went from having 30% hospice patients to like 1%. It was just an amazing, like literally in the course of a year, the nature of the practice that I was engaged in just completely changed. So I absolutely remember those days and that. And although the total number of AIDS deaths over the prolonged period was substantial, as I talk about in Apollo Zero, actually, I'm just looking now at figure 16 in the book, because I try to quantify this. Because COVID-19 is primarily an illness of the aged, 75% of the people died were 65, and HIV was primarily a disease of the young. Even though, roughly speaking, the total number of deaths were similar, the number of years of life lost from HIV in its course, 30-year course, was about 3 to 4 times as high